The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and iron as the stagecoach lurched to a stop at the frozen edge of town. Hooves stamped against the packed snow, sending up pale dust that glittered beneath the low winter sun. From within the carriage, a young woman stepped down, her cloak drawn close, her breath spilling white into the bitter air. She paused on the boardwalk, her boots crunching softly, and lifted her eyes to the man who stood apart from the gathered onlookers. Her voice broke the hush. "Do you recognize me, mountain man?" He stiffened, his hand tightening on the strap of his rifle. The townsfolk turned, curious, their whispers rising like a breeze through brittle grass. He stared at her, the line of his jaw rigid, the snow clinging to his dark beard. His eyes, hard as river stones, betrayed nothing. The woman's gaze did not falter. A strange calm held her, though her heart beat as if it meant to break free. She was no stranger here. She had known these streets in another season, when the world had been younger, when laughter had rolled across summer fields. Yet as she stood now, cloaked against the cold, she felt the town press against her like a wall of silence. "I was your childhood neighbor," she whispered, the words trembling as they passed her lips. For a moment the world seemed to still. Only the wind answered, threading through the wooden eaves, rattling a shutter loose. His face gave no sign of recognition, or if it did, he hid it with the skill of a man long practiced in silence. He turned slightly, as though her voice had brushed against him but carried no weight. The crowd shifted, disappointed that no reunion had blossomed before their eyes. Whispers ran quick, some marveling at her beauty, others sharpening words of doubt. A woman at the dry goods store door muttered about fine dresses not meant for frontier snow. A man by the hitching post chuckled, saying mountain men had no use for city women. The words stung her ears, though none were spoken to her directly. The mountain man let the rifle strap fall into place upon his shoulder. He gave her one last glance, eyes unreadable, and turned his boots toward the trail that led out of town. Snow creaked beneath his weight, steady and unhurried, until the figure of him disappeared into the whiteness at the edge of the woods. She stood still, the cold cutting into her cheeks, her body trembling though she did not let it show. The silence left in his wake pressed down harder than the weight of the townsfolk's stares. She pulled her cloak tighter and lifted her chin. With quiet dignity, she stepped toward the inn, her boots leaving faint prints the snow hurried to cover. Inside, the air smelled of pine smoke and stew. The innkeeper's wife greeted her kindly enough, though her eyes lingered too long, measuring, judging. A small room was made ready upstairs, with a narrow bed and a window that looked toward the tree line. The girl laid her satchel on the quilt, then sat at the edge of bed, still wearing her cloak, still feeling the cold buried in her bones. She pressed her palms together and tried to steady her breath. The voice she had carried all these miles still rang in her head. "Do you recognize me, mountain man?" Out in the woods, he walked with heavy steps, his boots biting through the crust of snow, the rifle across his back. He knew her. Of course he knew her. The years had etched changes into her face, yet her eyes were the same, bright and unwavering, like sunlight striking river water. He had seen them once in a meadow long ago, when the air smelled of clover and 2 children raced barefoot through tall grass. He clenched his fists as if the memory itself were dangerous. By the time he reached his cabin, darkness had settled across the valley. Smoke rose from his chimney in a straight, thin line. He opened the door to the dim warmth inside, the smell of pine pitch thick in the room. His dog lifted its head from the hearth, tail thumping once, then returned to its rest. He set the rifle aside, shrugged off his coat, and sat by the fire with his face buried in his hands. Her words haunted him, echoing in the flicker of flame. "I was your childhood neighbor." The truth of it seared him. He had not forgotten. He had buried it. And now, with one glance, she had unearthed it all. Back at the inn, she lit a small lamp and set it by the window. Outside, snow drifted in lazy spirals, tapping softly against the glass. She thought of his silence, the way he had turned away, and a chill spread deeper than the winter air could ever reach. Yet she refused to cry. She refused to yield to the easy sorrow that pressed at the corners of her spirit. Instead, she reached into her satchel, drew out a bundle of thread and cloth, and set her hands to sewing. Each stitch steadied her, gave her purpose, as though she could piece together her courage one thread at a time. Downstairs, laughter swelled from the saloon across the street. A piano stumbled through a song, sharp with cheer. She heard it all faintly, muffled by the snow that wrapped the town. The merriment made her feel more alone, but as her needle moved through cloth, a small strength rose within her, a quiet vow that she would not let this place, nor his silence, break her spirit. In his cabin, the mountain man lay awake on his narrow cot. The roof timbers groaned in the cold, and the dog shifted in its sleep. He stared at the shadows on the ceiling, remembering a girl with ribbons in her hair, chasing fireflies near the riverbank. He told himself he had done right, turning away, for he had no gift to offer her, only a cabin of rough wood and a life carved from silence. Yet even as he told himself this, he felt a weight of shame pressing against his chest. The night deepened, snow falling without sound. In town, her lamp burned low, a frail glow against the dark. In the woods, his fire sank to embers, a red heart beating in the hearth. Though they lay apart, both felt the same wind move through the valley, both listened to the same restless hush. And in the stillness, though unspoken, both wondered the same question. If the years that had passed had truly erased what once was, or beneath the frost of silence, something yet lived, waiting to be seen again. The snow fell steady, covering every track, every sign of the day. But memory has a way of leaving prints no storm can wash away. And as the night folded the town into its quiet arms, each of them lay sleepless, haunted not by what was forgotten, but by what remained. Morning came gray and brittle, the snow crunching under boots as townsfolk carried on with their chores. Smoke rose thin from chimneys, and the sound of blacksmith's hammer struck against the hush of winter air. In such a small place, any new arrival was bound to stir tongues, and the girl's presence had already become the favored subject. At the mercantile, whispers clung to the corners like cobwebs. Some admired the bravery of a young woman returning alone. Others scoffed, saying she had grown too fine for these weather-bitten streets. A few wondered aloud what business she had, returning where no one had asked for her. Their words reached her ears, though none were spoken to her face. Each glance weighed heavy, the kind of judgment a town delivers not with a shout, but with silence sharpened thin as ice. She bore it with quiet grace. Her back remained straight as she stepped into the shop to purchase thread and bread. The keeper's wife served her politely, but with a pause too long, the kind that carried more meaning than speech. Coins slid across the counter. She gathered her goods and left without reply, though her heart quickened beneath her cloak. Beyond the edge of town, the mountain man lived apart from such murmurs, yet he felt their weight all the same. Solitude had long been his shield. Each morning he cut wood, the axe biting through frozen pine, echoing to the still valley. The effort steadied him, yet memory pressed harder with every swing. The girl's face lingered before him, the curve of her voice, the sharp sting of her question. "Do you recognize me?" He had thought burying the past would keep him whole, but her return had struck like a blade against stone, throwing sparks into the dry dark of his heart. At midday, their paths crossed by chance. She stood at the town well, her hand stiff with cold as she tried to draw the rope. The bucket slipped, dropping hard against the stones, water spilling into the snow. He had been passing by with a bundle of furs on his shoulder. Instinct moved him before thought. He set the bundle aside, stooped, and lifted the pail, his hand steady against the cold iron handle. Without a word, he set it before her. Their eyes caught. For the briefest breath, the air between them warmed. Charged with memory, neither dared to speak. Then he stepped back, lifted his furs, and walked away as though nothing had passed between them. Her hand lingered above the bucket, not touching, but trembling at the echo of closeness. She wanted to call after him, to say his name aloud, but the sound died in her throat. To the others who watched from doorways, it was nothing, an act of courtesy. To her, it was a thread, fragile yet strong, pulling against the silence that divided them. That night, she sat in her narrow room at the inn, a lamp casting soft light across the wooden walls. She drew her sewing from her satchel, a square of cloth, pale and worn, along with thread that gleamed in the flame. Each stitch was small, deliberate, her fingers pricked by the needle but refusing to falter. The cloth bore no pattern, no image yet, only the slow forming of lines that steadied her. With each stitch, she whispered a silent prayer to herself, that roots could be found in this frozen soil, that the boy she once knew was not wholly lost behind the man's silence. Snow tapped against a window, persistent and cold. Outside, the town was hushed, the saloon across the street carrying faint laughter muffled by walls. She leaned closer to the glass and caught the dim glow of his cabin lantern across the white valley. It burned low and steady, the flame of someone who kept his own company. Yet to her, that glow meant he was awake, that his thoughts too wandered the night. She turned back to her sewing, steadying herself with the thought that perhaps his silence was not emptiness, but kind of shield, one she might one day learn to cross. He, meanwhile, sat by his own fire, the warmth licking his boots, the dog curled near his feet. In his hands he held a small carved figure, an old whittling of wood, rough and simple. It was a likeness of a horse, half finished, the toy of a boy who had once dreamed freely before hardship choked such things away. He had nearly forgotten he kept it, tucked in a drawer, yet tonight he had found himself searching for it, turning the figure in his hands. He felt the memory of her laughter when they were young, the way she had once dared him to ride across the meadow, bareback and reckless. Shame tightened his chest, for he had met her return not with welcome but with denial. His silence had been meant to protect, but instead it had wounded, and the wound now spread through him like frost through timber. Days passed. The girl walked the town streets with quiet composure. Each time she felt the weight of eyes upon her, she lifted her chin a little higher. She visited the church though no service was held, sat upon the pews, and let the cold settle into her bones as she gathered strength. She stitched by lamplight each evening, the cloth growing under her hands, though she kept the work hidden from curious glances. The mountain man kept his distance, yet their paths crossed again and again, the blacksmith's yard, the trading post, the frozen riverbank. Words were scarce, but the silence between them grew charged, layered with the things neither dared say. One evening, she stood at the edge of the frozen river. The snow was deep there, muffling the world to stillness. Her breath drifted into the night, her cloak brushing against her boots. She heard footsteps behind her. He approached, his coat dusted white, his face raw from the wind. He said nothing. She did not turn. They stood side by side, their gazes fixed on the distant sky, where geese flew against the fading light. He removed the scarf from his neck, ruffle still warm, and held it toward her. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his hand. No words passed, but her eyes filled with heat that burned away the cold. When she returned to her room, she folded the scarf carefully, laying it beside her unfinished sewing. 2 threads now bound her, one of her own making, the other offered by him. For the first time since her arrival, she allowed herself a small smile. Across the valley, in the quiet of his cabin, he too lay awake. Yet unlike before, shame was not the only weight upon him. There was also hope, fragile as a candle flame, trembling against the draft but refusing to go out. The town still whispered, still judged. Yet in the stillness of those winter nights, beneath the hush of falling snow, 2 hearts began to remember what had never truly been lost. The storm came sudden, sweeping down from the mountains with fury that rattled shutters and drove cattle to huddle against fences. Snow whirled in thick sheets, burying paths, silencing the town under a white and howling veil. In the dim glow of lanterns, people rushed to bar their doors and shutter their windows, praying the blizzard would pass before the woodpile ran low. At the inn, she struggled at her threshold, arms full of kindling too heavy for her slender frame. The wind tore at her cloak, near ripping it from her shoulders. The wood tumbled from her arms, scattering across the snow-crusted porch. She knelt to gather it, fingers numb, breath coming sharp. Then a shadow fell over her, steady and unyielding against the storm's rage. He was there, wordless, his broad shoulders dusted white, his beard stiff with ice. Without asking, he bent and gathered the wood, stacking it neat by her door. His hands moved with quiet strength, each log placed as if it mattered. She rose slowly, her lips parting as if to thank him, but the wind stole her words. When she met his eyes, she found only the briefest flicker of warmth before he turned back into the snow, his figure swallowed by the storm. Inside, she lit her lamp and watched the logs crackle to life in the small hearth. She pressed her hands to the flame, feeling more than its warmth. In that simple act of kindness lay the first crack in his silence, a thread pulled loose from the wall he had built around himself. She touched the scarf he'd given her, still folded carefully, and laid it across her lap as though it were a promise. The storm raged for 2 days. When at last the skies cleared, the town emerged shaken but alive. Snow lay heavy upon the rooftops, glittering sharp beneath the pale sun. She walked the marketplace, cloak drawn tight, her cheeks flushed from the cold. The eyes of the town followed her, sharper than before. Whispers rose. She had brought trouble with her return, the storm itself some omen. Others sneered at the sight of her buying flour, as if a woman alone had no right to live without permission. She felt the weight of every word, though she did not let her shoulders bend. Her hands trembled as she set the coins upon the counter. Behind her, silence grew sudden. A presence stood near, solid as the earth. She turned slightly. He was there, standing tall behind her, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet warning. The sneers died into their throats. No words were spoken, yet the space around her steadied. She gathered her parcel and stepped outside, her heart quickened not from fear, but from the shield his nearness had offered. Later, at the frozen river, she found him again. The water lay locked in ice, silent beneath a thin layer of snow. Geese passed overhead, their wings cutting the air. She stood watching, her cloak pulled close, when he approached without sound. He carried no rifle, no bundle, only himself. For a moment they stood side by side, eyes on the sky. Then, without speaking, he unwound the scarf from his own neck and offered it to her once more, though she already wore it. His hands were rough, steady, his gaze lowered, as if he had no words but only this gesture. She accepted, pressing the wool close, her eyes bright with unshed heat. Her lips curved faintly, the ghost of a smile fragile but real. No declaration passed, only a breath that lingered between them, warming the cold air. That night, in her room, she lit a single candle. The flame trembled against the glass as snow drifted outside. She turned toward the valley and saw, across the distance, a lantern glowing in his cabin window. 2 lights burning, fragile yet unbroken, watching each other through the dark. She pressed her hand to the glass, as though the distance might shrink beneath her touch. He too sat awake, his lantern steady beside him. He thought of the scarf in her hands, of her eyes holding both sorrow and strength. He thought of the town's whispers, cruel and sharp, and how her chin had lifted against him with dignity he himself had lacked. A quiet respect grew in him, mingling with the ache he had long carried. For years he had believed silence was strength, but now he wondered if it had been fear all along. Days unfolded with a rhythm both new and familiar. She stitched by lamplight each evening, her cloth growing into patterns faint but graceful. He worked the woods, carried furs to town, always keeping distance yet never straying far. Their paths crossed like threads weaving slowly into a single cloth, each meeting wordless but heavy with meaning. Once, she paused outside the church after gathering water. He passed by, shoulders bent against the wind. For a breath he slowed, and she lifted her eyes to him. A nod passed between them, small yet certain. In that moment, it was as though the years of silence had thinned the boy and girl that had been flickering to the frost like candlelight behind glass. The thaw was not sudden. It moved slow, subtle as a drip of meltwater from an eave. Yet with each act, each glance, the ice cracked. He stacked wood at her door, without being asked. She left a loaf of bread upon his cabin step, wrapped in cloth. He touched the scarf around her shoulders each time they passed, as though checking if it still warmed her. She pressed her hands to the window at night, watching his lantern glow steady against the dark. And so the days moved on, the town's whispers still sharp, the snow still deep. But beneath the silence, something fragile had taken root, a bond that neither storm nor judgment could sweep away. The thaw had begun, and though neither spoke it, both knew the cold could not last forever. The sky pressed low, heavy with gray, the air sharp as glass. Rumors had thickened like smoke in town, whispered from porch to porch. Some said the girl had returned to snare a man who wanted no snaring. Others claimed she would not last a winter, that her fine hands and steady gaze would wither in the frost. Crueler tongues wondered aloud if the mountain man had turned her away, because he knew better than to bind himself to wandering roots. Each word cut, though never spoken to her face. The weight of them followed her into every room. She sat one evening in her narrow chamber. Her sewing lay neatly across her lap, but her hands stilled. The cloth she had worked for weeks lay unfinished, her needle resting silent against the thread. The lamp cast long shadows across the walls. Her trunk stood open, half filled with folded garments, her few belongings stacked carefully within. She had told herself it was only preparation, but the truth pressed heavier. She was readying herself to leave. A town that would not see her. A man who would not speak her name. What hope was there? Outside, snow began to fall, fine as sifted flour. The inn's timbers creaked under the cold. She folded one more dress, her throat thick. Just as she lowered it into the trunk, footsteps sounded on the stair, slow and steady, a weight behind them that she knew. Her heart jolted. The door knocked once, firm but unsure. She hesitated, her hand hovering above the latch. Then she opened it. He stood there, snow in his beard, his coat frosted white. His breath rose in heavy clouds. For a long moment he did not speak. His eyes roamed the room, catching on the open trunk, the garments folded with finality. A muscle in his jaw tightened. "You were leaving," he said, his voice rough, as if dragged from somewhere long unused. Her hand clutched the doorframe. "What reason have I to stay?" The silence stretched, filled only by the creak of the floorboards and the muffled moan of the wind. His gaze lowered, shame pulling at his features. Then, with effort, he lifted his eyes. "I remember," he said at last. His voice cracked, soft but certain. "I never forgot." The words hung between them, stark as firelight in the dark. Her breath caught, her throat burning with 100 unspoken things. She wanted to ask why he had turned away, why his silence had cut so deep, but she saw the answer in his face, in the lines carved by solitude, in the eyes shadowed by years of keeping himself apart. He stepped into the room, slow, deliberate. His hand brushed the trunk, fingers grazing the folded cloth. Then he knelt, gathering the garments she had placed inside. One by one, he lifted them out, smoothing the creases, setting them carefully back into the drawers. Each fold was an unspoken plea, each placement a wordless vow. His hands trembled slightly. Yet he did not stop until the trunk stood empty, the garments restored as though her leaving had never been. She stood frozen, tears stinging her lashes, her hand pressed against her lips. When at last he turned to her, his eyes were no longer guarded. They were raw, open, filled with the shame of years, but also with something else, a fragile courage. Her hand reached for his, hesitant but steady. Their fingers touched, the contact light as breath, yet it carried more weight than any word. Forgiveness passed between them without voice, a grace neither had known how to seek, but both had longed for. The storm outside broke then, as if the sky itself had waited for this moment. Clouds split to reveal a scatter of stars, their lights sharp against the snow. Together they stepped into the night. The town hushed, the world blanketed in white. Their boots crunched side by side, leaving twin trails through the unbroken drift. He carried a lantern, its glow steady against the dark. She walked with a scarf wrapped tight around her, the rough wool holding the warmth of his presence. Neither spoke, yet each step carried a certainty deeper than words. They walked beyond the last houses, where the valley opened wide beneath the starlit sky. The snow glimmered as if scattered with glass. Their breaths mingled, white clouds rising into the still air. She lifted her eyes to him, not asking, not demanding, only offering the quiet truth of her being there. He met her gaze, steady now, his silence no longer a wall but a space where something tender could grow. They did not kiss. They did not make grand vows. Instead, they stood close, the lantern's glow circling them, the snow falling gentle, the world holding its breath. The moment was enough, more than enough. At length they turned back toward the town, their twin paths etched clear behind them. The lantern swung steady in his grip. The scarf held close at her throat. The stars burned high above, the night sharp and clean, as though the world had been remade in their quiet resolve. And so the girl who returned found that recognition did not come from names alone, nor from bold declarations. It lived in small acts. The scarf placed on her shoulders, the log stacked by her door, the garments lifted from her trunk with trembling care. It lived in forgiveness given without words, in the courage to stand beside another even when the world doubted. To those who watched from their windows, they were only two figures crossing snow. But to themselves, they were something more. Two souls long lost, found again, stitched together by threads stronger than time, stronger than silence. And if you listen close in the hush of snowfall, you may hear the truth of it. That love does not thunder nor break the earth. It falls quiet as snow, steady as breath, shaping the world not in grand strokes, but in the small grace of being seen and known at last.